All right. Welcome, 640 students. I am going to go through the Chapter 3 PowerPoint and share a little bit more information on the content for this chapter. And then if you have more questions, feel free to email, set up a meeting with me using the link I provided, or you can come to the chat session that's on Thursday. And for this class, the chat room, I will be in the chat room at 7:30 on Thursdays. And so you can always find me there as well. And so I'm going to share my screen. All right, so this chapter, we're discussing assessing the current environment to begin the process for the functional behavior assessment. And there are going to be several types of data we collect through the functional behavior assessment process. And this week, we're really going to focus on the indirect. And then in the next part of this module, we will talk more about data collection. And so next week, I'll talk about chapter 4. Or if you read ahead, that's fine. And if you have questions, you can let me know. But let's focus first on indirect assessment and this idea here that when we do a functional behavior assessment, we need to collect a lot of data. And it's going to be very important for us to have good information about the behavior and about the function of the behavior before we can create a behavior intervention plan. And so the first thing we do in the functional behavior assessment process is collect our indirect data. And so this is before we really do any observing, or maybe we've done minimal observing. We're going to use our indirect methods to gather more information. And that way we can be more targeted with our observations so that we can focus on the times when the challenging behavior is occurring most frequently or most intensely, so that we don't have to spend a lot of time trying to catch that challenging behavior happening, or trying to figure out what that challenging behavior is specifically. We'll have done some legwork beforehand. And so this starts our data collection process. And my hope is that as we go through this course, that you feel more comfortable with data collection, that we're not afraid of data, that we feel good about knowing how to collect quality data and using it to make decisions. So that's one of the objectives for this course. So when we start the functional behavior assessment process, we're going to talk about the interview in a minute, but we also can start with a records review. And so we can look through whatever records we have access to. Sometimes that is little to nothing, and that's okay. But sometimes we might have access to other assessments, maybe an old functional behavior assessment, maybe evaluations related to social skills or social emotional development, maybe evaluations or assessments that are academic in nature. So specific to how the student might be doing in math or reading or other academic content areas. And we also might have information about the student's past schooling experiences, maybe information about what's happening with the student outside of the school setting, maybe other settings that the student is in or at home. And we can use this information to guide us in the next steps of the process. And as we're doing the records review, we're going to be thinking about preparing to interview the people who would be able to tell us most about the behavior. And now the interviews don't have to be formal. So we call it an interview, but it might feel more like a conversation. We don't necessarily have to sit down for a long period of time with a long list of questions and have a back and forth. The interview might actually happen over the course of several days or even a couple of weeks, where we might ask some questions and then look at that information and come back and ask follow-up questions. And in fact, in a school setting, it's pretty common that the interview could get chopped up like that, because there would not be long periods of time that a teacher would have to just sit down and give an interview a lot of times. We might be able to catch them between classes or during a prep period or on their lunch maybe, or right after school for a little bit. And so we might break it down, and that would be okay too. It's also really helpful to get information from the students' caregivers when we can. And so sometimes that's easier or harder. I always advocate for family involvement in any process, anything we're doing with students. But in terms of collecting data, for a functional behavior assessment, if we're intervening in a school setting, we don't necessarily, from a science perspective, have to have an interview specifically from a caregiver. That being said, we still need consent from family members, and we still want them involved in whatever parts of the process they want to be involved. But again, it may not be a formal interview that we do with parents. If that doesn't work out, we could still proceed. Often in a school setting, the person that we would spend the most time interviewing would be the teacher who is with the student when the challenging behavior occurs. And that's going to get us the most useful information by talking to them. And then we can interview anybody else who works with the student. And we might also be interested in interviewing a teacher who works with the student and does not observe challenging behavior. So we might learn something about what is happening in the environments where the student seems to have more success or at least fewer challenging behaviors. So we can interview a lot of different people, and it's helpful to get different perspectives. The goal of the interview is to start narrowing in on an operational definition. And an operational definition is the definition of the challenging behavior that we use that is measurable and observable. So instead of saying something vague like the student is having tantrums, or the student has outbursts, or the student doesn't get much work done, those things are kind of vague. We want to pinpoint it. So the student is yelling, the student is hitting, the student is throwing work items on the ground. That helps us get more towards something we can see and that we can measure. And we will work on operational definitions in here as we move along. So at this point in time, it's not necessary to have a really good handle on that, but just in general to understand we're working toward having a definition we can measure. And when we do our interviews, people aren't necessarily going to report the behavior in operational terms, because that's not how we would think about a behavior unless we've been trained that way. And so we're going to hear a lot more either vague comments or vague descriptions like I just gave, or even something that focuses more on feelings or states of being. So we might hear people saying things like, well, the student is being lazy, or the student doesn't feel like doing their work. And those are not operational terms, because we can't observe that and then measure it. So we want to get at, well, what does the behavior look like? And so as we're interviewing, we'll ask questions like that to get at what the behavior looks like. The second goal we have with our interviews, besides collecting general information that will be helpful, but we want to work on that definition. And then number two, we want to work on narrowing down when and where that challenging behavior occurs so that we can target our observations. Most of the time, we're not going to be able to observe the student for long periods of time across multiple days. We'll usually have little small portions of time available that we can actually observe. And so we want to target when that behavior is occurring. And so the interview can help us narrow that down so that we can be more planful about when we observe. And then throughout the process, we're going to be gathering information about what else is happening. So what happens before the behavior and after the behavior, but this information isn't going to replace what we observe. It's going to supplement it. It's going to help us understand what the teacher is experiencing, and we still will need to do observations, which is what we'll talk about in a later chapter. The book also talks about student interviews, and I like to talk about it a bit because I think it's important that we consider when we interview students. And so my belief about this is that interviewing the student during the assessment process is not necessarily a good idea. So it is a good idea to involve the student to the extent they can be involved in the behavior intervention phase. And I think we can have a lot of success when the student has a role in that planning of intervention. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But right now at the data collection phase, if we were to interview the student, there are a couple of problems arise. So number one, we are basically letting them know that we're there to observe them. I mean, that's how it comes across, right? That we're there to watch what they're doing. And so there's a good chance that they will change their behavior based on that. They might engage in less challenging behavior, or they might engage in more challenging behavior. Kind of, put on a show since you're watching me. So it can change what would typically happen in that classroom. Also, we as humans are not necessarily great at being able to explain or understand why we engage in certain behaviors. Uh, so the student can be very helpful in talking about things that will help with intervention. So students very much can tell us about what motivates them, what challenges them, how they feel about school, how they feel about intervention, who they like to work with. They can tell us those things, and that can be very helpful for intervention later. But in assessment, even if you think about your own behavior, we all have behaviors typically at some point in time we want to change, and we don't necessarily fully understand why we engage in them. I mean, if we did, we could all change any behavior we had, right, based on understanding why we do it and then just making a change. It's not that simple. And so interviewing someone about their behavior to figure out the function isn't necessarily going to get us the information we need. So the chapter talks about it, so I talk about it here, but I really advocate for involving the student after you've collected your data and have them involved in the intervention phase. And that can be very powerful because then the student, not only is the intervention individualized to the student's needs and their strengths and their challenges and their goals, all things that they can definitely have input in, but then there's also buy-in, right? It becomes a collaboration where you're working together. So that's my spiel on where I think student interviews belong. And then we can also think about using some tools. So the book presents a few different tools that we can use during the interview process. And I will be sharing on Canvas at a later point in time a couple of these. So the Functional Assessment Interview Form, the FAI, is a tool that is a very lengthy document with all the questions you could possibly ask related to challenging behavior and getting at the function. And so I think this tool is best used if you look at it before you have your interview and highlight questions you might ask. And then if you're going to do a follow-up interview, you might come back to it and see what other questions you might ask. But asking all of them would take a very long time. It might not be necessary. So you don't have to use the tool in such a way that you ask all of the questions. I also like to tell people that you should not use it as something you would give to someone to fill out, because it would be very cumbersome and laborious for the person to fill out. And that's not really fair to the person, one. And also because the interview process helps us get good information. So you might ask a question, and based on what they say, your follow-up question might not be number 2 that's in that document. You might want to go where that conversation would lead you naturally and ask follow-ups related to that instead of sticking to a script. So, so a great tool, but again, I think it works best if you just use it for what you need. The other tool that I have that I will share with you is the Functional Assessment Checklist for Teachers and Staff, the FACS. And this document is in a checklist form. And so an advantage is it's very quick to fill out and easy to give to people. But the downside is it doesn't get very detailed information. And so this document should never replace an interview, but instead could be used to get information from people that maybe you can't interview, or maybe people that don't know the student quite as well. So maybe you wouldn't do a full interview with them, but you would like some information. So the way this all might play out then is that you might do an interview with the main teacher who sees the most challenging behavior, and then you might give the checklist to a couple of the other teachers who work with the student, and maybe even send it home for the parent to fill out. And then based on that, you could ask follow-up questions if you had them. And you could combine all of that information to write about perspectives from teachers and caregivers on the challenging behavior. And so interviews have some advantages. There's a good reason why we use them. They are not very time intensive compared to planning out and carrying out data collection and observational data collection. You don't need a lot of training to do this type of interview. So there are interview types that exist out there, like a forensic interview, for example, where people do have very specialized training. But for this, you don't need any specialized training. If you have a general understanding of the functional behavior assessment process and access to some of the tools, you can conduct these interviews yourself. And doing so allows us to gain multiple perspectives. So that's very helpful. But we have to remember that some of the pitfalls of the interview. So, and mainly that they are subjective. And so the information that you're gathering is going to be someone's perspective on the behavior. And that information can be very valuable. So we might want to have that perspective on the behavior. We just need to remember that it's not necessarily the most objective or the most accurate explanation or description of the behavior. But knowing that someone perceives it that way is important. That will help us think about intervention. That will become important later. And so we want to remember as we interview that people who are reporting aren't necessarily trained in behavior analysis. So the information they give may not be immediately useful in terms of the behavior assessment. So they might be giving information that could be helpful later or in different ways. And you might have to sort of bracket that and set it aside and dig through to get what you need for the assessment. And it's also possible and fairly likely that people are somewhat inaccurate in their reporting. So we do have some research that has documented that people might be more likely to report differently about the behavior based on what they just recently experienced. So for example, if I just got done working with a student and they had a very challenging behavior that maybe it's aggression and it lasted a long time, it was very intense and I just got done with that, and now I sit down with you and you're interviewing me, I might be more likely to report that it happens more often or that it lasts longer than it actually does because it was so intense. It was really hard and very difficult and very stressful to work through that challenging behavior. And so when I report it, instead of accurately reporting that intensity or that stress I'm feeling, it may come out as a report of a higher frequency or a higher duration. And so people are sometimes inaccurate, not because they're being dishonest, but because of that effect of having lived through that experience. The way they describe it could come across, could be reported in a way that's not accurate, but not on purpose. So that's something to keep in mind. And that also people may not be aware of the key variables that that need to be reported or that might be related to the behavior. And so some of what they're sharing might be missing pieces or might include pieces that you don't need. And again, this goes back to what I said a little earlier, where you have to sort of dig through and find what you need for the assessment. And so that is my spiel on indirect assessment. And so for this week, you can just focus on learning about indirect assessment. And then next week, you can focus more on chapter 4. And I'll be doing another session and I'll be in the chat room multiple times. So you'll have access to me and we can talk about that as well. And then activity 1 in here will be doing the IRIS module. And so the IRIS module online, I know some of you have had experience with doing these modules in other classes, and some of you may not, but the module has everything you need right in it. And so you can click through and there will be parts to read and things to watch and some activities to try as you learn about functional assessment. And then at the end, there will be 7 questions and you can type the answers to those questions on a separate document. And you can just number them 1 through 7 if you like, or you can cut and paste questions if you like to do it that way. And then you can upload to Canvas in the assignment area, the 1 through 7, and that's what will be graded for activity 1.